Today I'm going to walk you through how we're replacing the slate roof on this 100-year-old home behind me. I'm Nick Schiffer, a custom home builder here in Boston. I'm a company called NS Builders, and behind me is our Mansard project. We found a ton of issues with the existing roof, including the existing slate having to be removed from the project. So we're going to go upstairs and walk through all of the details and how we did it with Chris. Part of the Mansard design is the entire first floor is behind traditional walls, while the second floor is behind the roof entirely. The design stayed the same, but unfortunately we had to restore everything. All right, Chris, so second floor, tucked in the Mansard roof. When we started this project, one of the things that we noticed originally was a bunch of the woodwork we knew had to be restored.
Correct.
You looked at the slate, we talked about restoring it, but it was painted.
Correct.
So we ultimately decided that we'd strip the entire roof. Walk me through kind of that process and stripping it back, and ultimately what you found as you did that.
It was original slate to the house, because we know that because there was only 2 holes for each, so there wasn't multiple holes.
Oh yeah.
in the sheathing.
Yep.
So we knew that it was an original slate. And that meant everything else was kind of original, including the wood sills. It had wood trim, it had a wood crown, and the overhangs were partially original.
And part of slate, I mean, truthfully, a good slate install, and you guys are gonna have to bear with us because we are under a flight path here in Boston. It's actually really cool, except for when you're trying to record a video. The nice part about slate is that it literally can last hundreds of years.
Correct.
The unfortunate part was someone painted it. And truthfully, I think the worst part is they didn't even paint it a different color than it was. It was really just like they wanted it to be clean, so they painted it.
It was pretty gross. So, and it was a shame because it was really nice slate.
The wood trim, that's always something that, you know, when you're building, especially with wood and you know, despite maintenance or not, it is kind of designed to be replaced over time. It's over 100 years old.
Correct. In this situation too, with the flat part of the Mansard roof, you know, shedding a lot of water off of it, and the way these Mansards are built, inset to the house rather than proud of the house like you see on a lot of Mansard roofs, a lot of water was going to be hitting these areas. So
that section was all wood?
This whole, all this was wood panel going in. It was completely rotted. It was so bad we actually ended up reframing all the Mansard windows because they were completely gone, getting them all prepped and ready for
But we didn't reframe the roof itself.
No, the only, from basically from here all the way up is original frame of the house.
We have the vertical part of the Mansard, then the flat part. The flat part we end up using EPDM rubber roofing.
Correct.
Mainly because it's a low pitch. It's also not visible really from any point.
Correct.
So there's a cost savings there, but frankly we wanted it to be monolithic for, you know, snow and ice buildup over time.
Correct.
Once we stripped this back to the sheathing, at this point we're just installing an ice and water shield, is that right?
No, we ended up on the top part and the sides, we ended up resheathing over everything. So we put all new plywood.
What really drove that decision?
Because we were applying a new slate. So we wanted something really solid for the slate to attach to.
One of the things I noticed going down to our kind of fascia detail, so the guys actually had string lines running around the house. You had mentioned at one point the brick wall, it's not bowing out, but it was built bowed.
Bowed out over time, or it was built bowed. We had to accommodate for that. So we ended up making all our soffits and fascias straight and square, even though the building wasn't straight and square.
So how are you balancing the discrepancy from a bowed brick wall and ultimately the framing for the Mansard roof that also probably isn't straight? How are you balancing that with a straight soffit?
We were kind of finding a happy medium between the two. So trying to get it as straight as possible as we could without affecting the overall, because don't forget we also have a corbel going underneath here, so we couldn't shrink it up too much or it would affect the corbels too. So it's kind of a happy medium between everything.
What I noticed is that freeze board actually that is against the brick is, if you follow it down, it actually you can see it kind of gets in and out away from the brick.
Yeah, we actually strung the freeze board on the brick.
So is that where you're making up your discrepancy?
That's where we made up as much as our discrepancy as we could.
Got it. So you have that corbel detail, you come around to the fascia here, and then you have copper gutter. This is based on a K-style gutter?
It's a traditional gutter that you find in Boston. Some people call it a Boston crown that you'll see a lot.
Yeah, because it looks shallower than a
it's a little shallower than, but it gives us a little forgetting pitch on the fascia here.
So we have this exposed, and just to talk about it, this is a Boral material.
Correct.
Exterior.
Yep.
So the true exterior is a product that we'll use when we're looking for something more synthetic. We find that it doesn't move and expand and contract as much. It's a little bit more difficult to work with. It's also terrible on the tools, like you blow through bearings and blades, but ultimately once it's up, it really acts.
Once it's up, it stays straight. We still have to go back and sand off our joints, but joints won't open up. I've gone back to job sites a couple years later where we've used the Burrell product and hasn't moved at all.
Gutter gets attached to our fascia here.
Correct.
What's going between the gutter and this copper here?
There will be another piece of copper that'll hook onto here. There'll be individual panels that'll get soldered.
And just hold that there for a second. So just for those watching, this is not the detail, this is something up top.
Yes, on top.
But what Chris is saying is that there's a hem here which will get folded over, and then essentially they'll compress that hem to make this watertight, and then this will somehow turn into a drip edge into our
Correct.
gutter.
That'll have a hook too. So that'll come up and that'll get hooked.
So then this copper here gets installed before our slate, and it goes up behind the slate itself. And then we're getting into our window, essentially our jambs and our casing here. And then you have your step flashing on the side. Is all of this copper work done prior to the slate going on? What's the sequencing for that?
We left this off for a couple of reasons not to do it first, because they were doing the slate first. So we didn't want any slate falling down.
Got it.
And denting the
that
copper
makes sense,
gutter and denting that. So that the gutter will be the last in this.
It's funny how you think about that, because you think you work bottom up. On the coursing you would, but you have to think about damage, right?
Correct.
Like during install.
Yeah. So the gutter and this last piece will be the last that we do. Just going through, they had to do the sills and step flashing first. So all this sill detail work got done first, and then they were able to do their copper work into the step flashing. And then what will happen is this actually gets bent back, believe it or not.
It gets bent back towards the slate.
Gets bent back towards the slate. Each one of these joints will get soldered, and then what they're going to do is they're going to cut it off at 3/4 of an inch. We have that process going on over there. And then what will happen is that this will actually get a full cap of copper over that 3/4 inch bend. So now it creates so no water can get up into it. And then what will happen in here is we ended up doing this actually all in copper too.
We'll call them the outside extension jambs. That is all copper right back to the window.
All the way back to the window, and even more. We actually are going to end up wrapping copper into here.
We have Anderson 400 series windows. These are clad on the outside. What you're saying is you're going to bring copper right around and capture the outside.
And capture it all the way over.
3/4 inch.
We were worried about this interior joint here
Sure.
with all this water coming down and over time becoming a problem. So our solution was just to wrap it all the way into here. And that way we know any water that gets into here, it's not going to get in through the
Yeah, it's really, from an Anderson's perspective, they don't require that. These guys have done a great job taping over the nailing flange onto the window frame itself, but this is kind of that extra layer of protection. And it's going to look nice. The copper is, this bright orange when it's brand new. It turns to brown in about 12 months. And then, of course, over time, it will continue to oxidize, but it will really settle out to be a really muted brown, which will look nice against, obviously, the slate, the brick, and the brown paint that we have down on some of the headers.
And then even on this process, this will be 2 panels with a seam in the middle soldered.
So that's called, I think it's a flat lock, right?
Flat lock.
Yeah. Rather than a standing seam, which you would see on a pitched roof.
And the reason for that is as the copper gets larger, over time, it'll actually ripple. So smaller panels, you won't get that ripple.
So on this section here, is this flat lock as well?
That'll be flat lock as well.
And those will be done in as large of sections.
As large as we can get,
You said that they're working on this around the corner?
Yeah,
can we go around
actually take a peek at it.
Before we get all the way around, the corner, I noticed that all of these shingles are kept back. And this is actually a great section of how this copper transitions up behind our slate. My understanding is that they're actually not going to be weaving the corner, is that right?
No.
So what ends up being the detail here?
So what will happen is now that they've applied strapping to this corner and flashed over it, the slate will continue into here. And then I don't have it on me, but I can grab it, but there's a wrap over detail, copper wrap over detail.
Got it, so it has almost like a 3/4 round, right?
It's and then it'll actually flare out, and then it'll get hooked on to the corner.
And that goes over top of your shingle, right?
That'll go over the top of our slate.
So you have a nice kind of like, probably 4-6 inch
on each
copper
side.
band
Yeah,
going
on
up
each side.
the side.
Yeah, it's really gonna look sharp.
Got it. So these guys are working on one of the windows on this side.
So as you can see here, they bent it over, they cut it back. This will receive a copper kind of wrap around it.
Yep.
And then as you can see in here,
and you can see that detail with the Anderson.
They've
That was really nice.
They wrapped it over the Anderson.
Yep.
And as you can see, we have our hook here. That's where our panels will hook in. And then we'll have probably 3 or 4 panels going up on the side here.
That's nice. You can see how it wraps just that 3/4 of an inch.
Now we'll never have a water problem.
Right. This is a great view here too. Like this is the window that they're using to access some of the scaffolding. And Chris actually built a little U shape to protect that sill. Chris and I probably have plenty of windows that we've replaced through the years that we've been doing this, but just to protect that sill during construction. How are we installing the slate? This is a traditional slate.
Traditional slate.
They're pre-drilled, is that right?
They're pre-drilled, or if they need to drill it, their tool actually creates a hole in it.
The nails are all copper.
All copper.
Do we know why that is? Like, what's the reason for using copper nails?
Every job I've ever done, they've always used copper nails. There's one question I never asked. They always use copper. Someone will comment.
Yeah. Someone will be like, guys, this is why I use copper. And then how are they cutting them?
With a cutter. You put the slate in. It's pretty.
And you're kind of just like
snipping
it through?
This is your cutter down here, and you just kind of chop it. It's almost like a chopping effect. And you'll end up with this kind of rough cut on the edge.
Got it. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward in terms of how it gets installed. The key here is really getting nice straight lines. Obviously, this is a continuous or a it's a single width. It's not random width.
Correct.
Which is really important to get
uniformed,
that. Yeah. Uniform. That's the right word. So you need to get that 50% coverage back and forth. But I want to get back to the copper detailing. So as we get up, this was originally all wood above the window.
Correct.
And it tied into this kind of odd cornice detail on the existing house. And right now what I'm looking at is a bunch of plywood and rough framing.
Once again, we have a whole copper crown detail at the top.
Is that what's sitting on the scaffolding over there? Why don't we grab that and go up top?
Yeah, we can do that.
All right, so we're up at the upper cornice line. You can actually see our EPDM roof here. This side's actually not done yet, mainly because we have this addition being built where the existing garage is and we're tying in. This is actually a great spot where there's a bunch steps in progress. You have slate going in, and then you have your Grace ice and water, high temp here. And walk me through what we got with this.
They rebuilt the fascia, soffit, and the freeze board. And once again, had to go through the same process of stringing lines, making sure everything was nice and straight. It took some time for them to get this all kind of perfect.
But again, leaving this roof, existing framing.
Yes.
You rebuilt the windows so they were plumb and true, and then this
was
all moving in and out.
Everywhere. It was. We even flattened the first kind of foot of this roof.
To make sure that
we were nice and straight going all the way around. So this actually will end up hooking into there. Let me flip this over. And then that'll go.
Oh, I had it completely backwards.
Like that.
Got it. So this is freeze. And then this gets probably cut at some point and bent back.
Same thing, yeah. They'll have it long.
Yep.
Just in case there's any imperfections in the roof, they'll be able to bend it where they want.
So this clips on, and then you're essentially,
clipping on back to there.
And then that folds onto our rubber.
That folds on, and then they'll flash over that.
So why not do this work and then put this on top of it? I've always wondered that.
And it's just the way it's always done with every process with the rubber roof. The metal flashing goes over, and then you always flash over the metal.
Come over with your flashing tape.
With our flashing tape. Said the whole process I think that we did here was just, there's no maintenance on this at all.
Think about slate roof. It's a very expensive roof, but there is really no maintenance. Clean the gutters, you got a side that's not in the sun, maybe you got to clean the slate. Certainly don't paint it.
We don't have to paint it. I mean, with all this water coming off and the mansards the way they are, we would have done a beautiful job, of course, of doing a crown detail and moldings and stuff like that. But it would have been, I think, every 2, maybe 3 years of painting, repainting because of the process. Because, like you said, the sun, the rain, the snow sitting on the mansard shelves. It just would have created it.
And between copper and slate, we're talking decades and decades, and maybe 100 plus years.
I mean,
considering what was here and lasted 100 years.
Right.
Ultimately, this will all stay, but the EPDM can and likely will be replaced before this is ever even touched. EPDM probably has a life expectancy or warranty, maybe 30 years.
30 to 40 years.
This is a rubber membrane, very straightforward, very typical, but we added this Velux SkyMax Skylight at the very top, which really, transformed the inside.
Correct.
And mainly so they could see the airplanes fly over their house. That is what it's for. Talk to me a little bit about what it took to build that, because you're essentially at the critical point of the structure of this part of the roof.
Yep.
What'd you have to do in terms of framing it, getting that up there, like sequencing between roof and skylight?
The engineer kind of spec'd out a lot of structural LVLs. So we have I think on the sides we have 18-inch LVLs, and on the back and front we have 14-inch LVLs. It looks beautiful on the inside. It kind of splurges out. So that all got reframed. The shelf got built for the skylight to actually sit on, and that is actually, I think it's got a 2 or 3 degree pitch on it. So the skylight will still shed water off of it.
Yeah, because if it was flat, like stuff would stay up
just
there. You'll get leaves and things like that.
But it does shed off most of the water off of it.
Adding things like the skylight at the very top of the roof, those are just details that make our projects a little bit more special. We'll see you guys next time.